Good morning, spaceflight enthusiasts, and welcome to an angry bulletin that is pretty similar to a bulletin that I released about a week and a half ago, but I think needs an update. Very much like the fact that I keep updating 3i Atlas all the time with all of the new developments. Well, this needs to be updated as well, because we're talking about returning to the moon here for the first time in over half a century, and when it comes right down to it, things are not going well. We're in a pretty good position to get 95% of the way to the moon, but we can't quite make it all the way. And the whole reason for that is this is a very different moon mission design than the one that we had in the late 60s. In the late 60s, the whole idea was to deliver everything that was necessary to land on the moon and then return from the moon with a single Saturn V rocket. This meant that it had to be a very small spacecraft and an even smaller lunar lander capable of setting a couple of people down, a few hundred kilograms worth of material, and also perhaps the capability of bringing a couple hundred kilograms worth of moon rocks back up from the surface and return it to Earth. And that was pretty much it. That was the only capability that the Apollo missions had, and the only way to upgrade that capability, at least according to the designers of the time, was to build much bigger Saturn V rockets, super Saturn Vs, if you will, with lots of solid rocket boosters or just much bigger engines, 9 F1 engines, for example, instead of just 5, plus the solid rocket boosters that would end up on the space shuttle, etc., etc. These rockets, by the way, requiring enormous investments of money because none of them were designed to be reusable or anything. And of course, that whole plan got shot down by President Nixon and others. There were people on both sides of the aisle who didn't like it and thought that it would be a better idea to spend billions and billions of dollars bombing the hell out of Laos and Cambodia. All of that having been said, NASA's new idea of setting large amounts of cargo and larger groups of people down on the surface of the moon would require one of two things: either great big super rocket, as NASA was thinking about in the early 70s, or two different missions, one to deliver the crew to lunar orbit and another to deliver a separate larger lunar lander that would be capable of carrying larger numbers of people, larger amounts of cargo, etc., down to the moon's surface. You can't do that with a single rocket, again, unless it's a really, really massive expendable rocket that would be incredibly expensive. So the alternative is to deliver astronauts to orbit first and then have a separate mission take them down to the surface of the moon and then bring them back to the orbiting spacecraft. So that's been the design for quite some time. The plan is to, first of all, have the capability of delivering the astronauts to the moon, which we've had for quite some time now, and that is the SLS rocket. As expensive and wasteful as it is, it's pretty much done. It's been tested, and even though we haven't yet sent humans to lunar orbit with it yet, that's going to be done probably by February or March of next year, maybe April at the latest. But here's the problem. The big missing piece, and this is the HLS, or Human Landing System. And the entire story behind this contract has been full of all kinds of missteps and, frankly, some corruption as well. I'm going to give you the quick background on everything that happened from the beginnings of this HLS contract to where we are now and why we're in such a rough situation at the moment, and why such a radical change has now been implemented, taking the HLS program out of the hands of SpaceX and Starship and delivering it into the hands of somebody else. All right, once again, a quick rundown for everybody in regards to how this HLS contract got going and how it ended up in such a mess that we're in right now. Well, we, of course, being the Western world, which is competing against China, who seems to be doing a hell of a lot better in getting their astronauts down to the surface of the moon than we're doing. But in any event, let's go ahead and get started with the contract. There were a number of competing designs, quite a number of competing designs, mostly from the big players in spaceflight, but there were a couple of exceptions. For example, SpaceX and Starship, they had thrown their hat in the ring, and also a company called Dynetics, which had been well established in the whole spaceflight arena, but nevertheless not really one of the big, easily recognizable names. And then, as I said, a lot of the big players, including Boeing. Boeing had one of the simplest solutions when it came to an HLS design, a design that was very compatible with the Orion spacecraft and with the SLS rocket in general, a design that should have had a pretty decent chance to compete, but unfortunately, the individual at NASA, Doug Lavero, who was responsible for all of the decision-making, at least at the time, gave Boeing unfair competitive information on what they were going to need for this HLS system to be compatible with SLS, to essentially give Boeing unfair competitive information. And as a result, Mr. Lavero lost his job in 2020, and Boeing was not one of the finalists. And so there ended up being 3 finalists that nobody really expected. We have, of course, SpaceX and Starship, who eventually won the bid. You had something called the National Team that was led by Blue Origin, but had some collaborators who were part of the more recognizable spaceflight companies, Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman. And this thing, by the way, was a design by committee rat trap. This original Blue Origin design was very, very bad indeed. I released a lot of editorials as to why it was so bad. It was mostly not reusable. It was really tall and top heavy. And most importantly, its crew cabin accessibility was only achievable through a 10-meter ladder, one of the most impractical things I could possibly imagine. The notion of an astronaut with a torn spacesuit, for example, trying to get up this 10-meter ladder to get into the crew cabin before they died, a virtually impossible thing to achieve. And that was just one of a number of problems that a 10-meter ladder confronted folks with. And there are a number of other problems with this design as well. It just wasn't the best solution. So what about Starship? Well, at the time, and in the initial assessment of NASA, when NASA gave their first technical assessments to the 3 different designs, Starship actually came in last place because, for one thing, it was not a very mature design. There was so much complexity involved in getting it to the moon in the first place. I've talked about this a number of times. All of the refueling, for example. It's also tall, top-heavy, a lot of the same problems that the Blue Origin design had, and also the crew cabin. Even though you don't need to go up a ladder, it requires an elevator that takes folks up about 20, 25 meters, maybe even 30 meters before they can get access to the crew cabin. And elevators are not going to be particularly high speed on the moon. So that being the case, it would be very, very difficult for a crew in trouble to get back to the crew cabin. And then finally, the Dynetics ALPACA design, which was very low slung, crew cabin very close to the ground, but one of the drawbacks of this design is that it couldn't carry nearly as much cargo as either the Blue Origin or especially the SpaceX design. However, it could definitely carry up to 4 crew members, a couple of tons worth of equipment, payload, etc., enough to handle the early Artemis missions anyway, but certainly not a great solution for the long term. But still, the Dynetics ALPACA got the best technical assessments at the beginning of the process. In addition to that, Dynetics got more money than anybody else did. It was looking very promising for this company compared to the competition. And I was thinking at the time and was advocating for a SpaceX plus Dynetics solution, for the Dynetics ALPACA to be used for actually setting down on the moon and Starship to be used as sort of a fuel tanker, allowing the ALPACA to refuel over and over again in lunar orbit and set down on the moon repeatedly. This was not my idea, by the way, but rather the idea of the rather famous Dr. Robert Zubrin. But this is not the decision that was made. And incidentally, after Dynetics received all of these high accolades, got all that money on the front end, and after Lavero lost his job, new people came into power at NASA. People who, interestingly enough, are now working at SpaceX on this HLS solution almost immediately, well, within about a year or so of SpaceX being selected, of Lunar Starship being selected. These people found themselves working at SpaceX on this exact HLS solution. I'm not suggesting that there was any obvious favoritism here, but it is an interesting coincidence. So, in any event, Blue Origin wasn't chosen, Dynetics wasn't chosen, but the SpaceX Starship solution was. Blue Origin sued, and actually so did Dynetics to begin with. It first went to the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, who found in favor of NASA, said that NASA had made the right choice, and then Blue Origin took it all the way to the federal courts. Dynetics did not. They decided to let the whole thing go, and Blue Origin, of course, lost again. Although, now looking at it in retrospect, because Blue Origin was saying, for the same reasons that I say, that Starship may not have been a great solution, mostly because of all the refueling required, the complex infrastructure, etc. Well, in retrospect, they may have been right about all of that, but they still lost the court case and the whole thing went forward. And then a sustainable lunar lander solution came up. And then Blue Origin and Dynetics found themselves competing again. Blue Origin got rid of some of their co-conspirators, some of their partners, shall we say, and ended up with an almost entirely new design, this time with a crew cabin close to the ground, but still very top-heavy, very tall, this design. Not as bad as Starship, but still kind of having these drawbacks, but capable of carrying a lot more crew and a lot more payload down to the lunar surface than the Dynetics solution could. And then in the end, Blue Origin and the Blue Moon Lander won the sustainability contract. So in the end, SpaceX and Lunar Starship got the Artemis 3 and Artemis 4 missions. NASA had a lot of confidence in them. They got billions of dollars for those two missions, and the whole thing went forward. So Blue Moon and Lunar Starship, again, Lunar Starship with Artemis 3 and Artemis 4. But now, 4 years later, 4 years after the selection was made, more than 4 years actually, NASA has come to the conclusion that Lunar Starship is not going to be able to handle the job. So what the hell are we going to do next? So yesterday, NASA said that it was opening the marquee U.S. moon landing contract to other bidders because Elon Musk's SpaceX had experienced mounting delays with its Starship lunar lander. The move paves the way for rivals such as Jeff Bezos' Blue Origin to snatch a high-profile mission to land the first astronauts on the moon in half a century. Quote, "I'm in the process of opening that contract up. I think we'll see companies like Blue get involved and maybe others," the U.S. Space Agency's acting chief Sean Duffy, who also serves as U.S. Transportation Secretary, told Fox News' Fox and Friends program. Well, they get interviews with the guy, he won't even give me a statement. Secretary Duffy, can you give us a statement, please? Are you able to give us a statement?
No, we're good. No, thank you. How are you guys doing?
Doing all right. Okay, all that being said, let's continue. Duffy's comments follow months of mounting pressure within NASA to speed up its Artemis lunar program and push SpaceX to make greater progress on its Starship lunar lander, while China progresses towards its own goal of sending humans to the moon by 2030. It represents a major shift in NASA's lunar strategy, starting a new competitive juncture in the program for a crewed moon lander just 2 years before the scheduled landing date. Blue Origin is widely expected to compete for the mission, while Lockheed Martin has indicated that it would convene an industry team to heed NASA's call. Starship, picked by NASA in 2021 under a contract now $4.4 billion, faces a 2027 moon landing deadline that agency advisors estimate could slip years behind schedule, citing competing priorities. Musk sees Starship as crucial to launching larger batches of Starlink satellites to space and eventually ferrying humans to Mars, amongst other missions. Quote, "They do remarkable things, but they're behind schedule," Duffy said of SpaceX's lunar lander work, adding that President Donald Trump wants to see the mission take place before his White House term ends in January of 2029. And yeah, I would say with all confidence that given where Starship is now, there is no way in hell that a human-rated lunar Starship will be putting astronauts on the surface of the moon by the end of 2028. But let's continue. The move is a significant change under the agency's acting leadership, and as the White House and Duffy begin to reopen the nomination process for a permanent administrator, billionaire entrepreneur and SpaceX customer astronaut Jared Isaacman, an ally of Musk's, is now in talks to reclaim his nomination that has been yanked by Trump over the summer. Musk shrugged off the specter of more competition in a social media post. Quote, "SpaceX is moving like lightning compared to the rest of the space industry. Moreover, Starship will end up doing the whole moon mission. Mark my words." Well, perhaps it'll do the whole mission someday. I think that Starship may have that capability eventually, but the notion of doing the whole damn thing by 2030, given the progress that Starship has made over the last 3 years since its first test flight, no way, and I'm glad that NASA has finally figured out that this is not possible. Bezos's space company Blue Origin, with its Blue Moon lander in development, has a similar lunar landing contract awarded by NASA in 2023, but for later Artemis moon missions, starting with the Artemis 5 mission. The company had protested NASA's initial decision to only pick SpaceX in 2021, as I mentioned before, and fought for years to convince the agency and lawmakers to select another proposal as a redundancy. Duffy's reference to Blue Origin on Monday suggests that Bezos' space company could contend for Artemis 3. Blue Origin has been developing its Blue Moon lander in Florida with relatively little public attention under a contract worth roughly $3 billion, and SpaceX has been developing Starship in Texas in a whirlwind campaign of test-to-failure demonstration missions. But NASA has grown uneasy with a lack of progress on lunar lander-specific development milestones. Pressed for details on Duffy's remarks, a NASA spokesperson said that the agency has told SpaceX and Blue Origin to present accelerated moon landing plans by October the 29th. NASA is also going to request plans from the entire commercial space industry for how NASA can increase the cadence of our mission to the moon, the spokesperson said. In a statement to Reuters, Bob Behnken, Vice President of Exploration and Technology Strategy at Lockheed Martin Space Unit, said the company this year has been conducting significant technical and programmatic analysis for human lunar landers. Quote, "We have been working with a cross-industry team of companies, and together we are looking forward to addressing Secretary Duffy's request to meet our country's lunar objectives." Bezos and Blue Origin CEO Dave Limp reportedly spoke with Trump over the summer when the Republican president was feuding with Musk. Representatives for SpaceX and Blue Origin could not immediately be reached for comment, but one thing that the Reuters article doesn't bring up is the potential of resurrecting ALPACA, because even though no significant work has been done on ALPACA since 2023, it remains remains the only HLS solution that passed its preliminary design review, and that was way back in 2021. Blue Moon hasn't done it, and Lunar Starship, in spite of all of these test flights, and in spite of all of the efforts that have been made to develop this rocket, has not passed its preliminary design review for a lunar lander. And it is the fact that Lunar Starship has not yet passed its preliminary design review, to say nothing of its critical design review, or CDR, yet, that makes me so confident that there's no way it can put humans on the surface of the moon before 2030, and it may even be later than that. And if you think SpaceX can do anything and they're going to be able to design and complete Lunar Starship far quicker than any other competitor, well, maybe that's true, but let's look at Crew Dragon, the only human-rated vehicle that SpaceX has ever completed. It passed its critical design review, or CDR, in March of 2011, and its first unmanned flight was in 2019. 8 years for the supposedly blindingly fast SpaceX to go from CDR to a completed human-rated spacecraft, which, by the way, goes to orbit, doesn't land on the moon. Landing Starship on the moon is going to be orders of magnitude more difficult than a Crew Dragon reaching orbit with humans on board. NASA has made the right move at this point, and in my opinion, they should seriously consider going with the HLS solution that has actually passed its preliminary design review and might have the slightest chance of landing humans on the moon by the end of the decade, assuming that Dynetics actually did some work between 2021 and 2023 when they got passed over again. Let's hope that's the case, because I don't see too many other alternatives that are actually going to be putting humans on the moon for the United States anyway by 2030. So there we are. Again, in my opinion, even though it's been years since anybody has done any real engineering work on ALPACA, it's still the design that has made the most progress thus far. It's the only design that has completed a preliminary design review, or PDR, and given its progress when it was abandoned, it was a vehicle capable of delivering at least 2 and probably 4 astronauts down to the surface of the moon, along with lunar rovers, pretty much everything that is necessary for early Artemis missions. And on top of that, with it being low slung, a lot safer, a lot more viable transport method for putting astronauts onto an extremely dangerous lunar South Pole with notoriously bad terrain. It's just the best way to handle the problem, and always has been. And the fact that we have had to wait for 4 years for NASA to come to this conclusion, and by the way, they still haven't come to this conclusion, to be clear. I think it's very likely that they're just going to go with a modified Blue Origin solution, as I suggested in the video. I think that's probably what they're going to end up doing rather than ALPACA, which is going to have its own problems. But in my opinion, the only way to realistically have a chance of putting astronauts on the surface of the moon before 2030, before China manages to do it, is to go with the only solution that has completed its preliminary design review, PDR, and that is ALPACA. Theoretically, 2 years after a PDR is complete, the critical design review can be completed. So in other words, maybe by 2027, the CDR will be done. And then perhaps 2 years after that, ALPACA might be able to set down on the moon by 2029, standing at least a snowball's chance in hell of beating China to the moon. We'll see what happens. I will keep all of you up to date. Thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. And until next time, stay angry about space.